So we looked at the book of Esther. When we did Ezra and Nehemiah, I mentioned the fact that chronologically it would fit in between those two books, more correctly between chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra. That's where the time period of Esther would have come. So we look at just a little timetable review. I like to keep things straight in your mind so you kind of see how things flow historically. Remember, the Jews returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, 536 BC. The temple was completed in 516 BC. Esther became queen of Persia in 478 BC. And the time where she saved the Jews from annihilation, that was about 5 years later, about 473. That was when Purim took place, which we'll read about here later. And then Ezra arrived in Jerusalem about 457 BC, and Nehemiah 13 years later in 444. So you kind of see how those things went. If you remember that Nehemiah was cupbearer then to the son of Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as he's known. All right. The author of Esther is really unknown, but it had to be someone who was really familiar with the customs of the Persians and the Jews. He knew historically what was going on, the workings of the Persian court. He had to be very familiar with that. And also the geography of the region, because he talks about that a lot. So this was somebody who would know. Perhaps it was a Persian Jew living in Susa. Perhaps it was even Mordecai himself. There's several places that Mordecai says he wrote this and he wrote this, and perhaps he's the one that compiled this. We just don't know for sure. But whatever it was, we know that the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. All right? And that was a little stickling point for Martin Luther, there's a quote here from Martin Luther. He said, Esther was less worthy of being in the canon of Scripture than any other writing in the Old Testament. But if you look, you can see God's hand working through the entire book. Providentially, he's working to save his people. And we'll look at some examples as we go through the text. Several commentators believe Esther was probably written about 400 BC, the purpose being to explain this festival of Purim, how it came to be, and how they were to celebrate it every year as they even do now. So the time period then of Xerxes, if you have, like I use the ESV, it's Ahasuerus, same guy, just different name. He ruled Persia from 485 to 465 BC, about 20 years. He had a reign of 20 years. He died in 465 BC. His grandfather was Cyrus, the one who gave the decree for the Jews to go back after the Babylonian captivity. His father was Darius, and his son was Artaxerxes. So he kind of puts them into order there. So you understand that you've heard these names, and that's where he was in the line. The city of Susa was about 200 miles east of Babylon, okay? And the citadel was the winter home of the Persian king. So that's where the story takes place, in the citadel of Susa, 200 miles east of Babylon. So if we were to outline Esther, we just do a quick outline. I like to do that because it kind of helps things flow. This book's different because it's a continual story. It's a short story really from chapter 1 and flows all the way through chapter 10. So it's not like you stop and look at this and look at that. Just a continuous flow, which is really neat in biblical literature. As I said, it's a historical narrative. But if we look, the first two chapters of introduction, we were introduced to King Ahasuerus, Queen Vashti, who was disobedient for whatever reason. We'll look at that briefly. The rise of Queen Esther, and then a conspiracy at the end of chapter 2 discovered by Mordecai. That plays a key role. Right? Chapters 3 to 5, Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. So Haman's promotion to being the head of state, basically the prime minister, a plot against the Jews in chapter 3. Mordecai's counterplan in chapter 4. Esther visits the king. Very dangerous meeting that she had. Could have gone bad. And then the end of chapter 5, Haman's plan to hang Mordecai. And then the third part of the outline would be God saves the Jews. Chapter 6 to the first part of chapter 9. We have a sleepless king, humiliated Haman, and a celebrated Mordecai. Chapter 6. A lot of events occur there in chapter 6. Haman's execution, the plan to protect the Jews in chapter 8. Victory for the Jews, first part of chapter 9. And then the conclusion in 9 and 10 is really the introducing this feast of Purim. And then at the end, Mordecai is honored in chapter 10. So one thing I want to point out as we look at this, because I mentioned that God is not mentioned here. All right? There's no mention of prayer, no mention of anything religious in this book. But it's full of many it just so happens moments, okay? We might call them coincidences. It's a coincidence. Or what irony this was. But these just so happens moments really help us to remember the promise of God given back to Abraham and to Moses and to David. God's working through all this. The Lord will protect his people, and through the line of David will come the Messiah who will reign on the throne forever. And so we keep that in mind as we read this, because you're not going to pick it up unless you're looking at God's hand working. So what I want to do is go through the chapters and show you, and everybody's probably read this book, maybe you've studied it intensely, but to look at God's hand working, it's pretty amazing. So chapter 1, we're introduced to King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. He reigned over this vast kingdom that went all the way from the eastern portion was on the border of India, Pakistan, all the way across Iran, Iraq, modern day, across the Middle East, over to Greece, across the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to northern Africa. It's a vast kingdom that he had. And he was in a process of going to invade Greece. He had warfare against Greece, and as for the setting of this, probably around 480 BC is when they say that he was going to invade Greece. And he had this 180-day, a 6-month celebration of his wealth and prosperity, and look at all that I've done. And he has all these dignitaries and soldiers and everybody there. And the last 7 days he has this feast. And there was much eating and especially drinking. And you know what happened there. When they're all merry with wine and happy on the last day, he asked the eunuchs to bring the queen to him so he can show her off. And the text says that he asked for her to come with her crown. And some people have wondered, well, maybe she's just supposed to have her crown on, nothing else, and that was the reason that she refused. Or perhaps she just didn't want to be part of a drunken fest, whatever it was. The queen refused to come, and he deposes her. That's it. I won't go into detail about that, but he says she's not going to be my queen anymore, and his right-hand men said, get rid of her, because if this spreads out, her disobedience, then all the way through the kingdom, the men are going to be, not going to be able to rule. The women are going to take over, and that was a bad thing, they said. So, chapter 2, that basically has a beauty pageant. They're going to go and find all the beautiful virgins throughout the whole empire, all these provinces, and bring them to the king and have his harem. And we're introduced to a man named Mordecai. And Mordecai was of the tribe of Benjamin, of the son of Kish. Does that sound familiar to you? You may remember someone in the past who was a Benjaminite and was the son of Kish. His name was Saul. Okay? And he was raising his young cousin, Esther, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah. And it just so happens that she is chosen to be queen. It's one of those just so happens moments. But she doesn't reveal that she's a Jew. That's a key point here too. So the end of chapter 2 then, Mordecai discovers a plot to assassinate the king because he just so happens to be at the right place by the gate when he hears this 2 men talking that are going to assassinate the king. He reports it, it gets to Esther, she tells the king. They investigate, and these 2 men are hanged. They were found guilty, but Mordecai is never given any distinguishing that they even knew that it happened. He wasn't honored in any way. Again, that plays a key role for what happens later. So, chapter 3, we're introduced to this man named Haman the Agagite. He's a descendant from the Amalekites, particularly of King Agag. Now, your mind should be going back a few weeks ago. In fact, you have mentioned in a sermon 2 weeks ago, and then we studied 1 Samuel in chapter 15. Remember, Saul was supposed to destroy and wipe out all the Amalekites, and he keeps the king alive, King Agag. And Samuel asked for him to be brought before him, and he hacks him to death, the scripture says. He had to do what Saul would not do, that God had ordered. And so, once again, we have the tension building here because we have a descendant of Saul against a descendant of Agag. And it kind of raises up the tension in this story as we go through it. So here comes Prime Minister of Persia, but he hates Mordecai because Mordecai will not bow down to him. All right? He only is going to bow down to the Lord God and not any man. And so that just rubs this Haman the wrong way. So he determines, I'm going to eliminate all the Jews. Let's get rid of all the Jews. Not just Mordecai. I want them all out of the kingdom. Everybody. And so they cast lots. The P-U-R. They cast lots, and they come up on this day, the 13th day of Adar on the calendar. It's about a year from that point, so they can plan and get everything ready. And what he does, he takes this, he goes to the king. If you remember, he doesn't tell him specifically who these people are, but he says there's people who don't obey you. They do things you shouldn't be doing, and let's get rid of them. And the king says, okay. And put it in perspective, I want you to listen. It says in this text, 10,000 talents of silver. A talent, 75 pounds. That's 750,000 pounds of silver. The closing price of silver Friday was $21.38 an ounce. So basically what Haman was offering to give to the treasury of the king to get rid of the Jews came to $262 million in today's currency. He hated the Jews to give up that much wealth. But it shows you how much wealth they had. He's willing to pay to kill all the Jews. The king agreed, sealed it with a signet ring, and it cannot be revoked. It was sent out to the entire kingdom. Chapter 4 comes. Mordecai finds out about the plan. He goes into mourning. He tears his clothes. He's sitting in sackcloth and ashes by the gate, and they tell the queen. She finds out what's going on, and they have this back and forth. But he gets the word to her that Esther has to help, or she too will be destroyed. Right? She's a Jew. She'll be destroyed. She'll be found out. And Esther says, it's dangerous to appear before the king, so I need you to fast. It doesn't even mention prayer. We know what's going on, but she goes, I need you to fast with your people, and my girls will fast with me. And I want to read for you in chapter 4, beginning of verse 12. We'll do some of the reading here. It says, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Famous line. And then Esther says, she said, reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. And then I will go to the king. Though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So Esther then appears before the king. I think we told you last week, we looked at Nehemiah. Remember, he went to prayer for 4 months before he took his plea to King Artaxerxes, because it was dangerous to appear before the king in an unworthy manner, to be sad or whatever. In this case, he had to present the golden scepter, and if you just showed up at the door and you weren't invited, that was a bad thing. The king got aggravated with that, and it could have been off with your head. And so she finds favor, as God would have it, right? It's one of those just so happens moments that she gets favor with the king. He asks for her wish, and she invites both the king and Haman to this festival, this feast she's having, and they show up. But the king asks for her wish. And she says, my wish then, right now, is for you to come tomorrow to another feast. Both you and Haman show up. And she says, if you do that, then I'll give you my deep desire. I'll give you my wish. He offered her up to half the kingdom. All right? So Haman then leaves this feeling like he's on cloud 9, man. I'm in with the king. I'm in with the queen. They love me. I'm going to another feast tomorrow. But he goes by and Mordecai, he sees him. Oh, man, I hate that guy. I hate these Jews. So you see, he's like happy and angry at the same time. And he goes home. And his wife, he's telling him all the great things he's done. And his friends are there. And he says, but you know what? As long as I see that guy, I can't have total joy. And they say, why don't you have a gallows built and tomorrow morning have him executed? And then you can go to the feast in peace. That's a good idea. What a great idea. So, chapter 6, this is the turning point. A great just so happens moments. What happens? The king can't sleep that night. He can't sleep, and he figure, well, if you bring me the book of my memorable deeds, you read those to me, maybe I'll doze off like counting sheep. And as they're reading to him, he finds out this man named Mordecai uncovered that plot way back when. Did we ever do anything for him? No, sir, he was never honored at all. we got to do something for him. Now it's getting daylight, and who's out in the courtyard but Haman? Haman's coming to petition the king to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows. He stayed up all night having built. He probably needs some coffee. And he staggers in, and the king says, what should I do for a man that I really highly esteem? And he's thinking it's him, It's just a great irony here. And he says to do all these things for him. And he says, well, everything that you said, go to do for Mordecai the Jew. Chapter 6, verses 6 to 11. Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse the king has ridden, on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes of the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor. And let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, this is it. Hurry, take the robes and the horse you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. And now he heads home after this event, and he's in great despair, and he's can't figure out what's going on. And his wife and his friends change their perspective. And in the middle of all this, remember, he's dead tired. He's been up all night supervising the construction of a 75-foot high gallows. And we see verse 14. What happens? While they were yet talking with him, because they told him now, this is bad. This guy's, he's got you. And while they were yet talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Man, what's he feeling like now? Chapter 7 then. At the second feast, the truth is revealed. Haman begs for mercy. In fact, it looks pretty bad because he's almost attacking the queen. And the king goes out in the courtyard and he finds out. Chapter 7, 7 to 10. She points out that it was this evil Haman. He wants to wipe us all out at this point in time. It says, Haman was terrified. The king is angered. And he goes out into the courtyard. It says the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went out into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where the drinking wine was taking place. And Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. It's bad. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman's prepared for Mordecai, whose words saved the king, remember, we just read that last night, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. It's just waiting for someone. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. And then the wrath of the king abated. Remember the promise that God gave to Abram in chapter 12, verse 3. Way back when in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. He said this. He promised Abram, he said, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And then the promise of a Messiah. And through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God keeps his word. God keeps his promises. And he's working here to get rid of one of the enemies of the Jews. But we still have a little problem. Haman's property is given to Esther. She gives it to Mordecai to take care of. Mordecai is honored by the king. You think about Joseph in Egypt, the Jew who was brought up and was given command of all of Egypt, just one step below the Pharaoh. Think of Daniel in Babylon. The Jews who were of high moral standards were brought up, and now we have Mordecai put in charge. But there's still one big problem. Remember, there's an edict coming out on the 13th of Adar that all the Jews are going to be wiped out. And that cannot be revoked by Persian law. So there's nothing, though, that says they can't defend themselves. And so they talk to the king. And you remember that God is working behind the scenes here through all these circumstances to make good his promises. He will not allow his covenant people to be destroyed. So chapter 8, verses 7 and 8 says, King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I've given Esther the house of Haman. They've hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So now there's another edict that's going to go out and say the Jews can protect themselves on the 13th of Adar. And so it tells us that verse 10, this is how this thing came about. They wrote this up. And it says, "And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses," to show you the urgency to get this word out. The king's swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate. The same wording that was used by Haman's edict, to kill, destroy, and annihilate. Any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On that particular day, they were going to do this. And so this goes out to the people, and there's a lot of celebration because they know they can defend themselves. Chapter 9 then, the day arrives in which Haman had hoped to destroy all the Jews. And this translates, if we took it to our modern calendar, it would be March 7th, 473 BC, March 7th, in the springtime of the year. And that's when they celebrate Purim. It's different days in March, but it's usually somewhere around the first or second week of March. And in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, we see what happens. The 12th month, which is a month of Adar, the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for fear of them had fallen on all people. Verse 5, the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased with those who hated them. They're not attacking anybody else but those who were coming after them. In Susa, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. Getting rid of him, all right? God's providence. The enemies will be taken care of. And God's going to take care of his people. And it makes specifically to tell us 3 different times they did not lay hands on the plunder. Why? This wasn't about them getting rich. This wasn't a get-rich-quick plan. It's about to save the people of God against evil. That's what it was about. We're told that 75,000 enemies were killed throughout the empire, and then a second day was needed in the Susa. So they have the 13th and the 14th day of Adar. Outside of Susa, there's only 1 day, but 2 days inside Susa. And so we now have what's known as the Feast of Purim in chapter 9, verses 20, beginning in verse 20. It says, Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliged them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. They should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The Jews accepted that, what they started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them, for Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is lots, to crush and destroy them. But God had other plans. A little aside, this celebration, my associate veterinarian who had bought my practice, she had her daughters in what's called Doxa Dance, which is a Christian dance group. And sometimes they would go back and look at some of the Jewish feast as part of the Christian heritage. And every year in March, whenever Purim was, she would actually make the Hamadashan cookies, which are Haman's ears cookies, and bring them into the clinic. And we all would partake. And every year we kind of poke fun at Haman for what he had done. So even to this day, even among non-Jews, it's kind of interesting that we would do that. So chapter 10, very short chapter, but what we see, verse 3, Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. And he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. He's prominent in the Persian Empire. You know, God has and always will protect his people. He'll work through any circumstance. He'll do whatever's necessary to make his sovereign plan come to pass. So think about Romans 8:28. Just as we close, that verse came to mind as I was looking at this. And Paul writes, and this verse has been overused, and it's like John 3:16, it's taken out of context sometimes. But you look at it here, in all these circumstances, it says that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who were called according to his purpose. So he worked all these circumstances out. When it looked like it was the end for the Jews, and they had the upper hand, God flipped the circumstances, working through ordinary people, ordinary means, because he's sovereign over all things, and we need to remember that. His name's not mentioned, but oh my goodness, hopefully you can see that he's working through every circumstance that happened here, and he's in total control. Again, the redemption of his people, looking forward to Christ. All right? Any questions or comments?